climate deniers. That's apparently what we are at Guerrilla Science, Tom Nelson and me. The insult is a deliberate play on Holocaust denier, and it's meant to induce the same kind of revulsion. Climate deniers, like Holocaust deniers, are not only denying an obvious, undeniable fact, the act of denial itself constitutes a disgusting moral crime. Climate denial, of course, is associated with the far right. You're supposed to be rubbing shoulders with the Nazis. You're in the Nazi tradition. And it's not just Antifa boneheads who say this. A leading academic in the Journal of Human Rights and the Environment says the arguments of climate deniers are just like those of the Nazis. Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury, who presided over the funeral of the Queen and coronation of the King and married Harry and Meghan, suggested climate deniers are worse than those who turned a blind eye to Nazi atrocities. It's ironic that he was later forced to resign, accused himself of turning a blind eye to paedophile abuse in the church. Charlie Kirk was a vocal climate denier and highly critical of radical Greens. He's been called, and by prominent academics and journalists, a Nazi and a hate-spreading Nazi. They're the worst kind, I imagine. And rather weirdly, literally Hitler. His rallies were like Nazi rallies. Charlie Kirk believed in free speech, open debate, individual freedom, free markets, small unobtrusive government, the Second Amendment, Christian values, and was rather fond of Israel. Traditional American values. Were these Nazi values? His critics believe in censorship, regulation of the media, greater state control of people and the economy. They want to hound people out of their jobs for saying the wrong thing, are derisive of Christian values. They want gun control and express support for people who kill Jews and would like to kill more. They embrace radical environmentalism and tend to despise traditional American values and American capitalism. Which group, we might think, Charlie Kirk or his critics, are closer to National Socialism? To those who've studied the Nazis, it should be blindingly obvious that the Nazis hated almost everything that Charlie Kirk stood for, and that, in fact, it's Charlie Kirk's socialist critics who are closest, disturbingly close, to National Socialism, on every single point mentioned above. I'm going to save for my next film the question of were the National Socialists socialist? Spoiler alert, yes. In this film, I want to look at the Nazis and environmentalism. Not just were the Nazis green? There is no doubt that they were. But how much did their green ideology excuse and justify and push them to do what they did? Okay, picture the scene. At the edge of a forest, German soldiers point their guns at rows of Jewish people standing by trenches. Among them are young mothers clutching their babies. Shots echo through the woods, and their dead bodies fall into the ground. Down the road, while this is happening, their German army comrades are busy establishing nature walks and bird sanctuaries and planting thousands of trees. The Nazis conducted horrific experiments on children. I've seen footage so upsetting it can't be shown on TV. But at the same time, they banned medical experiments on animals. The same Nazi monsters who committed crimes of unimaginable barbarity also advocated vegetarianism, organic agriculture, forest preservation, and homeopathic healthcare. How could we possibly explain this? What was the connection between the inhuman brutality of the Nazis and their gushing idealization of nature? The Nazis were green, and not just a bit green. They invented environmentalism. Many books have been written about this by well-established historians, like the collection of academic essays, How Green Were the Nazis? Very. Anna Bramwell's Blood and Soil, Hitler's Green Party, Zubrin's excellent Merchants of Despair, a brilliant book on the Green Volk movement and the Nazis by Professor George Moss, Intellectual Origins of the Third Reich, Eco-Fascism, and so on. The point of looking at Nazi environmentalism is not just to poke fun at the Greens. If environmentalism had been a peripheral interest of the Nazis, it would be of no real historical significance. Environmentalists could be forgiven for saying, oh well, the Nazis were green. Unfortunate, of course, but so what? The trouble is, environmentalism was not an accidental optional extra to National Socialism. As we're about to see, green ideas were at the very core of Nazi thinking. Green ideology inspired and justified the Nazis' horrendous crimes. To understand how and why, we must understand some history. So let's turn back the clock. In the area that would become Germany, the most powerful bit was Prussia. And what Prussia was famous for in the 17th and 18th centuries was its mighty military bureaucratic state. As Friedrich von Schütte put it, Prussia was not a country with an army, it was an army with a country. To support its vast army, the Prussian ruling class built a vast state bureaucracy. Legions of tax assessors, inspectors, collectors, customs officials, toll guards, accountants, clerks and supervisors and controllers of every kind. As well, of course, as state-funded school teachers and clergymen. An entire class of people dedicated to running the bloated Prussian state machine, whose incomes and status depended on the state. Universities, once funded by the church to churn out clerics, were taken over and funded by the state to churn out state functionaries. As the state expanded, so did the number and size of universities. University professors were very conscious of their role as servants of and cheerleaders for the Prussian state, and a university education pointed in just one direction: state service. This created, in the words of Professor Fulbrook, Germany's new state-dependent, state-sustaining professional classes. At the bottom of German society, labouring to support this immense oppressive edifice, were the serfs, legally unfree peasants, forbidden from leaving their lord, forbidden from leaving their plots of land, forbidden from owning property or from marrying without the lord's permission, forbidden from becoming a priest or from following a trade. And serfdom was in their blood. It was an inherited condition. The child of a serf was automatically a serf. A serf can only beget a serf. The rise of capitalism in England and the Netherlands had been marked centuries before by the collapse of serfdom in those countries. The end of serfdom and the rise of capitalism were not two events, but one. Serfs sought their freedom, and capitalism is what happened when they got it. In Germany, however, it wasn't until the 19th century that the sudden, shocking end of serfdom hit, like an earthquake. Next door in France, the serfs had won their freedom a few years earlier by overturning the existing order in a revolution. When the German army was defeated by the French at the Battle of Jena, the German rulers feared that they too would suffer the same grisly fate as the French nobles. And so serfdom was formally abolished. In 1807 in Prussia, the serfs in wider Germany didn't fully win their freedom till 1848 as a result of armed uprisings in the Austrian Empire. It is hard to overstate the enormous significance of this change. Centuries of feudal restrictions on the economic activities and the mobility of the lower orders were suddenly gone. The serfs, who for centuries had been forced to work without wages, under legal compulsion, whose lives had been down to the smallest detail controlled by their feudal masters, the grovelling and obedient serfs, had finally won their freedom. They now demanded wages, or else they would go elsewhere. They would go to the towns and cities, and did in huge numbers, to find paid employment as free men and women in any one of 1,000 occupations. The transformation, not just for the serfs, but for Germany as a whole, was spectacular. Within 20 years, German industry more than doubled in size. Shops sprang into life. The railway network trebled in size. Towns and cities ballooned. New roads started crisscrossing the land. The pace of everything was electrifying. The former humble obedient serfs were quickly becoming assertive townsfolk with money in their pockets. They could move jobs to find higher wages. They could gain promotion. They were courted as consumers. They could save and they could borrow. They could and did start businesses. Soon, like the French masses, they'd be demanding political equality. They no longer showed grovelling deference to their old masters. In German towns, the state officials were no longer feared and revered. They were now despised as paper-pushing, tax-sponging parasites. The old German governing classes, the officer class, the Prussian civil service, the state-funded, state-hugging, university-educated elite, experienced a loss of status and loss of income as the industrious classes escaped their control and overtook them. It was like the world had been turned upside down. For the bureaucratic ruling elite, the arrival of industrial capitalism was an existential crisis. Just how much this shook them can be seen in the angry writings of Nietzsche. For German reactionaries like Nietzsche, the abolition of serfdom was a tragedy. He complained that everything base has become rebellious. He was horrified by the great, evil, protracted, slow rebellion of the mob and the slaves. He said, "Let us face facts. The people have triumphed. Or the slaves, the mob, the herd, or whatever you want to call them. Masters have been abolished. The morals of the common man have triumphed." He called the newly liberated serfs the grumbling, oppressed, rebellious slave classes who aspire after domination. They call it freedom. They were the rabble who were making life hell. Life is a fountain of delight, but where the rabble also drinks, all wells are poisoned. The fact that the masses were now expecting political rights was truly appalling. The democratic movement is a form assumed by man in decay. Capitalism was that darkening and uglification of Europe, which has now been going on for 100 years. The old German ruling classes hankered after the world as it used to be, before capitalism came along and spoiled everything. The world as it used to be was how nature intended. Peasant freedom was unnatural. Peasants, by nature, were organically bound to the soil as serfs, blood and soil, Blut und Boden. Liberating capitalism was an offence against the natural order, against nature itself. Towns and cities were unnatural. Industry was unnatural. These sentiments, bitter, angry, nostalgic, anti-capitalist, cohered into a radical movement known as Volkism. Folkism. Volkism became the defining worldview for Germany's distressed intelligentsia. University students and graduates, professors, school teachers, German writers, philosophers and composers. We see it in leaden, melancholic German Gothic romanticism, in the invented folk tales of the Volkist brothers Grimm, and Wagner's ridiculous pagan fantasies of magic rings and goblins. It's all like a Tim Burton film without the jokes. For the Volkists, since capitalism was unnatural, their attack on capitalism was presented as defending nature. Dozens of highly political nature conservation groups were established across Germany. By the 1930s, 60% of the members of these various green groups were members of the Nazi Party. National Socialism had green politics at its core. Its leadership, Hitler, Himmler, Hess and the others, were green to their fingertips. The Nazis created the first nature reserves. Hitler advocated renewable energy of water, winds and tides. The Nazis were vegetarians and promoted homeopathic alternative medicine and organic farming. A supply of organic food was specially put aside for the SS to keep them pure. Hitler makes constant, gushing references to nature in Mein Kampf and elsewhere. His reverence for nature, the need to return to nature, the crime of going against nature. The Nazis established a powerful Reich Nature Protection Office with Hermann Goering in charge. Goering was made Reich Master of Forestry to promote the close to nature ideals of the Dauwald, the eternal forest. He declared, "The people are a living community, a great organic eternal body," which was echoed in the Nazi slogan, "Ask the trees, they will teach you how to become National Socialists." Walter Dare, head of the SS Race and Settlement Office, was made Reichsbauerführer, Reich Peasant Leader. His job was the Nazification of the countryside. A new Nazi law attempted to reimpose feudal relations on peasant land, forbidding inherited land from being bought, sold or mortgaged. Hundreds of thousands of Polish peasants were reduced to serfdom once more. The Nazis attempted, unsuccessfully, to re-establish a Völkisch peasantry by distributing free plots of land to German workers. And it was in search of land to do just this that the Nazis marched into Poland and beyond in search of Lebensraum, living space, to be made available by the mass slaughter of East Europeans. Dare has been described by one historian as father of the Greens. Hermann Goering declared a total ban on animal vivisection, an end to the unbearable torture and suffering in animal experiments. He warned that those found guilty would be sent to concentration camps. The Nazis would carry out the most brutal, sickening, murderous medical experiments on Jewish children and women, but not on rats and rabbits. The Nazi regime was probably the most environmentalist of any government in history. Of course, as we find today, their environmentalist policies were often quickly shown to be self-defeating and unworkable. The Nazis wanted organic peasant farming, but discovered very quickly that it would not produce nearly enough food. They hated factories, but they wanted tanks and guns and warplanes and rockets. They hated capitalism, but they needed tax revenues and to borrow money to pay for the gigantic, sprawling, tax-gobbling Nazi state bureaucracy. But the fact that the deranged green fantasies of the Nazis weren't practical and didn't make sense didn't disturb them, as indeed it doesn't disturb Greens today. Now what matters in all this is not that the Nazis created modern environmentalism, which they did. What is vital to understand, and what is truly worrying, is that environmentalism provided the rationale and the perverse moral worldview which justified in their minds their disgusting inhuman crimes. It was their green worldview that made the Holocaust possible and desirable. The green Nazis hated the Judeo-Christian tradition that put great value on humanity. Humans had no special value. They were no more special than other chunks of nature, of no more moral value than a beetle or a rat, or in the case of Jews, of weeds. The Jews were enemies of nature. Nazi conservationist Hans Schwenkel said, "Since the first book of Moses, the Jews do not know nature protection. The Jews exploit it as a divine right of personal selfish enjoyment." Hitler's favourite philosopher, Schopenhauer, condemned the Jewish view that regards the animal as something manufactured for man's use. In the name of justice to animals, he said, "It is high time Jewish views on nature are brought to an end." The Jews themselves were an offence against nature. They were an invasive species to Europe, and invasive parasites spreading Jewish poison. The Nazis viewed Germans as an endangered species that needed to be saved. Nature was key for the Nazis, and at the heart of nature was natural selection, survival of the fittest. Hitler's closest advisor, Rudolf Hess, said, "National Socialism is nothing but applied biology." Himmler said the Holocaust was in accordance with the law of nature. By eradicating weak and harmful elements, the Nazis were acting as nature did. The Jews, who were rootless city dwellers and capitalists, were unnatural and unhealthy. They were, in Hitler's words, a virus, a plague, a mortal threat to the health of the nation. It was the Nazis' green nature worship, its green view of humanity as just another bit of nature, that justified building the gas chambers. Nature was cruel, and the nature-loving Nazis would follow its example. Hitler was absolutely explicit. There is no tolerance in nature. Nature, if I take tolerance as a human concept, is the most intolerant thing that exists. Nature destroys everything that is unfit for life. The horrifying truth is that green thinking was not a sideline for the Nazis. The idealization of nature and the organic, the nostalgia for the Middle Ages, their hatred of modernity and progress, all this defined their poisonous ideology. It was the green attempt of the Nazis to recreate a peasant society which led them to invade Poland and murder millions of people in search of living space. It was their green anti-capitalism and loathing of bankers which led them to slaughter Jewish people. It was their green rejection of the Judeo-Christian tradition, with the value it put on human life, their green return to pagan animal worship, their idealization of pagan barbarism as more authentic, that led them to treat humans as worthless creatures with no more claim on our sympathies than viruses and pests. Green ideology was at the core of National Socialism. When we wonder what diseased thinking could motivate people to turn on the gas taps at Auschwitz, this is where we must look. Former Nazis were directly involved in the formation of green organizations and political parties in post-war Germany. Germany had the first ever Green Party, and it's still got the biggest Green Party in the world. This should not surprise us, but it's disturbing. When we hear modern Greens calling their opponents Nazis, really, the irony is too great. Still today, in modern environmentalist writing, we see humanity described as a virus and a cancer that must be cut out. When we hear leading Greens complaining that there are a few billion too many people on Earth, don't think for a moment that it's a joke. They believe it. They're deadly serious. After the war, the use of the insecticide DDT to combat malaria across the world is estimated to have saved 100 million lives. Good news, you might think, but not to the Greens. As one leading Green complained, DDT has greatly added to the population problem. The Greens staged a hugely successful campaign to ban the use of DDT. That ban resulted in a rise in the number of deaths from malaria of an estimated 60 million people. 60 million dead from one Green campaign. Did environmentalists then or now give a damn? I'm unsettled, but not in the least surprised, when I see prominent Greens on scary demos shouting, "Crush Zionism." When I see Greens calling for media censorship, for laws to make climate skepticism illegal. When I see school children led out of schools by their Green teachers, having been indoctrinated by Green school books, to go on deranged anti-capitalist climate marches. It's the Green climate fanatics who one might call Holocaust deniers, not because they deny the Holocaust happened, but because they deny that their vile anti-human nature-worshipping ideology had anything to do with it. It's not just a jibe to say Greens have much in common with the Nazis. It's a simple historical fact. I won't start calling Greens Nazis. They're not, strictly speaking, Nazis, and the left's abuse of the term sadly has turned it into an empty slur. But it really is imperative that we take seriously the question of what National Socialism was and how it came about. We owe it to the millions of victims of the Nazis and to ourselves to be mindful of where environmentalism came from and where it leads. I'm Martin Durkin, and this is Guerrilla Science.